Sure, yeah. I think this is pretty much everyone.
It's your show.
So they were coming.
Bring it.
My show. Okay. Yeah, I have a couple slides ready, mostly just to organize my thoughts and so I don't forget anything I wanted to talk about. So I guess I'll share them. Yeah, I assume we will jump around and ignore them, and the conversation will go in tangents or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's mostly just to remind me. I called it freelancing the ugly bits, since most of freelancing is ugly bits. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Cool. All right. Yeah, so I was just going to start by saying, how I got started in freelancing. This is a very embarrassing picture of my first ever freelance contract. I was 15. This is like, it was like a government funded program where they would the Ontario government, Ontario is the province where I live, would give you a bit of money so you could learn how to start your own business in the summer. So that was how I got started doing app development. I literally walked up and down the main street of the small town where I'm from, knocking on small business doors. I would say, hi, I can make you an app. And they would say, what's an app? And then I would leave. And I did that for a whole summer and made 3 or 4 apps, which is pretty fun. Yeah, I had no idea what I was doing. Like I said, I was 15. I had started app development 3 months before that. I didn't know what I was doing, and mostly I still don't. So that leads me into some caveats that I wanted to bring up. All my experience freelancing is in app development. It's pretty different from a lot of other software development. I guess it's most analogous to front end, usually, although in app development, you're usually in charge of the full stack. Apple, and I do iOS, not Android, so that's another caveat, I guess. So Apple tends to abstract a lot of the backend, data storage stuff away and makes it pretty easy. So everything I say will be mostly applicable to app development and front end on top of that. I've never done freelancing full time. I don't do it to support myself. I just do contracts as they come up around my schedule in school. I imagine a lot of the things I would say would change if I was trying to do it full time and feed myself and pay the rent and all that. But mostly it's just a side hustle. Yeah, and all the projects I've done are pretty much short term. I've never done anything longer than 3 or 4 months. So that's just a bit of the background of where I'm coming from. A lot of my advice would probably change. I'm sure there's other people here who have done different things from me. They can jump in whenever they want. Don't be afraid to interrupt me either. I really don't mind. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. And I figured we could just go in kind of order of how the general freelance project would go. So first you find a client and then you write the contract, and then yeah, we'll kind of go through it in that order. And then I'm sure we will branch off and talk about whatever nonsense we come up with, like we usually do. Yeah, so I think we figured we could get started with finding clients. Unless anyone has questions about what I've already said. No. Okay, so yeah, finding clients. Like I said, a lot of this advice would change if I was trying to do this full time. But since mostly what I'm doing is just fitting it around my existing schedule, my approach mostly comes down to just making it known to everybody that I'm available to do this kind of thing. Mostly app development and front end, which is kind of uncomfortable a lot of the time to bring it up to people, especially in real life. Be like, oh, a lot of the time it comes up in conversation. They say, oh, what do you do? I say, I'm a freelance app developer, just to kind of plant that seed that that's something I can do. Feeling pretty much everybody I know, it's a big part of my brand online too, is that I say on Twitter a lot, by the way, I have, open time for projects if anybody's interested, and then you get a little list of what you're good at. That can be kind of uncomfortable too if you're a lot of people are introverted like me, and then you don't like selling yourself, and it's a bit uncomfortable to say that you have monetary value as a person, but if you're going to do this, then you got to kind of get over that.
Did that get easier as time went on?
It does, and it especially got easier since I was thrown into the fire. Like I said, I was knocking on people's doors, pitching to their faces, which knocked a lot of the awkwardness out of me pretty early. Yeah, and the other thing I do is I never turn down a conversation. If people come to me with an idea and it's something that I don't do at all, they may come to me, hey, I have this idea for a really great I don't know, back-end service. I don't do that at all. I never do. But I don't turn down the conversation, right? I just talk to them for 15 minutes because there's no harm in doing that. And then, that person can become somebody who you go to later on. If the different projects come up, they refer your name to people. So that's kind of my main approach, is just tell everybody that freelancing is something you do, and then never turn down a chance to talk about it, which is uncomfortable, but it's kind of what you got to do. And then the other thing that leads into pitching is pitch all the time. Just spend all your time pitching, especially to people you don't know, because then there's fewer stakes. right? That's how I kind of justify it to myself. If you're pitching to someone who you don't know and you think you really don't have a chance of getting a project, that can be kind of pressure-free environment to work on that. Like it's pitching practice, basically. Right? Like you can just work on your general pitch, like of yourself and of whatever project you're pitching. That's a chance to do it with a low stakes environment if you're not worried about embarrassing yourself, or if you think that there isn't much of a chance that this will turn into a project. That just can give you like a worry-free environment. And yeah, so like pitching is mostly an interview, right? It's the same advice to that applies to interviewing, applies to pitching as well. Like, you know, standard interview advice, like talk about yourself, be personable, be friendly. They're pitching themselves to you as well, same as an interview, right? The company is not just interviewing you, you're interviewing them to see if it's a place you want to work. The client is also pitching themselves as somebody who you want to work for. So that can include things like, you know, trying to figure out like what their budget range might be, whether they are willing to like overpay or underpay you is something you can figure out in the first like 15 minutes or half an hour of the conversation. You know, figure out just their communication style. If they come off really unprofessional in their first meeting, that's obviously a giant red flag and not something that's likely to change once you start working for them, which I've learned through hard experience, which I'm sure we'll get to. Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind when you're pitching is like, are you talking to an engineer or not? Right? What engineer, like what industry is the person that you're talking to? Are you a front-end developer and they're back-end and they're looking for someone to, you know, take a part of their front-end project, because then you can get technical with them? Is it like a sales or an HR person? Because then they're mostly not going to know what you're talking about with the technical part. So you want to just kind of stick to the product side, especially if you're doing front-end-ish kind of stuff, which is mostly what I do. Then you can show non-technical people kind of examples of what you've done, which is you know, an easy way to get them to kind of understand what you're talking about sometimes. Yeah, so I don't have I don't have a ton to say about pitching, except you should do it all the time, as much as you can. When you think you have a shot, when you think you don't, you should do it to people you know and people you don't know. It really doesn't matter. It's all practice. So yeah, does anybody have anything to say about that? We can jump in at any time, jump around, interrupt me. I don't care. We should. I don't really have enough to fill a full hour, so. Okay. All right, we can just move on to contracts. So I guess after the pitching phase, it can pretty quickly get into a discussion of contracts. And to me, contracts includes pretty much everything. It includes the scope of the project. It includes how you'll be communicating. It'll include, you know, things that like methods for modifying the contract if that comes up. You know, pretty much everything that is discussed after the initial pitch should eventually be included as part of the contract. Is my advice. Like your contracts should be, they should touch every part of what you'll be doing. Some countries and states have template contracts that you can do, but they're not usually like software specific. Sometimes you can find like freelance template contract, but it refers to any kind of freelance work, and then you can modify it to work with software. But really, honestly, you should talk to a lawyer and not me. Like you should, I'm just not the right person to talk about. When I first started doing this stuff like 4 or 5 years ago, I just had a friend who was a lawyer. I reached out, we talked about it. He gave me like a kind of template contract that I've taken and modified over time. There's some parts of it that I understand and some parts of it that I mostly don't. It's like legalese that I understood at the time when he told me about it, and now I have largely forgotten. So yeah, you should not be talking to me about this. You should mostly talk to the lawyer.
I know locally we have a small business administration that
yes,
you know, every so often provides these kind of services, as well as like kind of like, I don't know, lunch and learns essentially of like, let's talk about contracts, you know, let's teach you what you need and why you need it. So it's definitely something worth investigating, because it's typically they're free or they're like $20, you know, just something ridiculously low. So it's like well cheaper than really hiring a lawyer, but yes.
Yeah. So like there's in Ontario, there's like the provincial government has set up like a program where most like large cities or large towns and cities actually have like a small business center, and they have office hours and things like that where you can go in and talk to them. That's a really great resource. That's how I got my start. That's that you know, government funding I was talking about, that high school program. They'll go in and mentor you about things like this. And yeah, there's also the other thing I was going to mention is professional liability insurance is a thing you can look into. It's generally pretty cheap. You know, where I am, it's about $50 a month. I also don't really understand it. It doesn't mostly apply to what I do. because I'm generally doing, like I said, short-term small projects that don't have large ramifications. And for me, the like cost benefit of getting some kind of insurance just hasn't been worth it. But if you're thinking about doing it full-time, or if you're doing it in some kind of an industry that is a little more serious, like if you're freelancing for a healthcare company or something like that, it's definitely something to look into. Yeah.
Does that fall under like errors and omissions insurance? Is that essentially the same thing that is?
Yeah.
Okay. That's just
actually
not expensive more than you realize. No. It just really depends on what you're doing. You know, shop around, obviously find a broker.
Yeah.
But in those that I have talked to about, just liability insurance, yeah, it's worth it, for how much it costs. So.
Yeah. Yep. Like I said, in my area, it's like $50 a month. I don't imagine it would be that much different. I mean, I'm also in Canada, so it's probably different, but there's that.
It's pretty cheap here too, yeah. And definitely worth it.
Yeah. So this is, we can probably spend a little longer talking about pricing because it's a thing that a lot of people get hung up on when they're first starting freelancing. It's really hard to figure out how much you're worth. It's really hard to figure out kind of the standard cost for what you're doing, especially because it's so dependent by area. And since most of your contracts will probably be remote, and like I've had contracts in tons of different countries, then that everybody will have different kind of expectations and standards when it comes to pricing. So I guess the best way to talk about it is that there's basically 3 different ways. There's lots of different ways you can price a project, but there's 3 main ways that freelancers kind of argue about which one is best. So there's hourly, project, and value-based. Basically what those means is hourly is just like it sounds. You use a time tracker, you charge by the hour. Under the same category falls in, like you can just charge for a half day or a full day, depending on your schedule. Same basic idea. You're charging for a set amount of time at a set rate that's laid out in the contract and not subject to like negotiation or anything really. Then there's project-based pricing, which says, okay, I will deliver you this product by this time, and I will charge you exactly this much money. You can do half upfront, a lot of people do, and then half upon completion. And value-based is like the most complicated one. It basically means you're trying to guess what your project is worth to the client, which is hard to do without a lot of experience in the industry. And you will either, mostly I would recommend not doing value-based pricing. I just thought I'd include it because a lot of people swear by it because they say you can charge way more, but a lot of the time what ends up happening is your guess is just completely wrong of the value of the project. So yeah, I would recommend not doing that because you would end up way over or undercharging a lot of the time.
I have, I don't know, I guess maybe a slight opinion on that. Like I agree with you completely about value-based, but I've also just done value-based in certain situations. But I have attached that value to a specific amount of time that I'm saying, this is what I envision what we're spending on it, as a slight ability to be able to renegotiate should that be completely inaccurate. Because I obviously, typically have those phrases in discussions with anyone that I've ever, contracted with before, to just say, look, this is the scope, this is what I'm expecting, and I try to be as detailed as possible to give myself an out at any possible situation. Like,
yes,
anything I've learned from real estate contracts, just like find an out for everything.
Absolutely, yes. That's something you can write into a lot of your contracts. You should always have a way to cancel. Well, not cancel. No, there should always be some kind of clause that says, okay, any renegotiations, you should have a very detailed plan with exactly what you're going to do, and anything beyond that, you have to renegotiate the price, and you have to hold yourself to that, and that can be a really hard thing to do, right? Because if the client asks for another small feature, and to them it doesn't seem like a big deal, but maybe to you it's something difficult, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's still something small. You have to charge for it, because otherwise you just end up devaluing your own time, even if it doesn't seem worth it. Even if you only end up charging for an extra 3 or 4 hours, you have to hold yourself to that standard. Otherwise, they won't value your time.
When you are figuring out your hourly rate, I think most of the situations that I've been in, they want an estimate of how long it's going to take you to do that project. So if you're working on something new, or you're using a new technology or something, how do you try and estimate that amount of time? And then what do you do if you're off? Like, has that happened for you?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that happens a lot. So usually what I do if I'm working with something really new, I tend to lowball it, just because then, I can't promise what I usually do. So say if I've done a little bit of web development freelancing, and I tend to charge less just because I have less experience in app development. and less confidence in what I can deliver. So what I often say to my clients is I'll say, okay, this estimate, a rough estimate, this is going to be a 40 to 50 hour project. But what I'm going to say is I will take the next or the first 5 hours of that and basically like see how it goes. So like take a test drive for 5 hours, and then you can often get a better estimate after that of time and than you can from just before you've done anything at all. So I will say to my clients, okay, I'm going to guess like off the top of my head that this will take 40 to 50 hours, but I'm going to come back to you with a better estimate after 5 hours, and don't be surprised if my initial estimate was off by a lot. And then at that point we can reevaluate. And you can have clause for that in your contract as well.
Becca, what I tend to do is I give an overall time estimate in the beginning, and then like I say a project is expected to be 30 hours, and then after every 10 hours of work I've done, I give them an update on whether I'm on track or we have extra time left over, or if I've gone over and I think I need to readjust the time. But I do it on a regular basis so the client is never surprised at the end.
Yeah, that's also something you can explicitly build into the contract to say, I will give you these updates every 10 hours or whatever it ends up being. You can also, if you're doing project-based pricing, which is something I do hourly about half the time and project about half the time. You can also split the project up into like submodules kind of, and then say, okay, upon completion of this portion of the project, I will charge this amount of money and then we'll reevaluate for the rest. It's also something you can do. What else do I want to say? I wanted to cover in pricing. So like a lot of people tend to undervalue themselves at the start, me included. That's something that this group helped me rectify as we talked about my pricing strategy a few months ago, and I definitely raised my hourly rate. Is because it's hard to remind yourself that the time that you took to learn is an investment. Like we've all spent hundreds of hours practicing development at this point. That time is an investment, but the investment only becomes profit if you pay yourself back for it. And so you should include those time estimates in your value as a person, right? Well, not as a person, as a developer, I should say. So if you have 5 years of experience that you got mostly unpaid for because you're doing open source projects, personal projects, side hustles, that's an investment in your time that you need to pay yourself back for. Otherwise, what was the point? So you should factor that into your hourly rate. You're not just charging for the hours that you're working, you're charging for the hours that you spent building up the skills to work. And also the pricing starts in the pitch phase. I just wanted to say, a lot of the time when you're pitching or when somebody is explaining their project to you, you can kind of tell from their language whether they're going to severely undervalue your work, and then you can just kind of nip that in the bud. Or maybe you can tell that they've got deep pockets. Or a lot of the time, I've actually had this happen. My client will mention someone that I'm talking to. They'll say, "Oh, I talked to an agency, and they quoted me $40,000." And then there's like dollar signs going off in my head because I'm like, "Wow, anything I say to you is going to sound so cheap." So you can kind of get that idea in the pitch phase sometimes. And then also pricing is highly situation dependent. Like there's proponents for all three of these pricing strategies. You can find like millions of blog posts that will say that each one is the definitive one that you should use. But yeah, it'll change in every situation, and you should update it over time. And after your project is over, you should reevaluate kind of how it went, and then use those lessons in the next one.
Can you explain the difference between value-based and project-based pricing?
Yeah, so value-based, you're basically trying to guess how much profit that the client will take from the project over time, and then give yourself a percentage of that. So if you're building let's say you're building a website that's a storefront, and you want to estimate their sales over the next year based on the storefront that you give, and then you say you want to pay yourself like a 10% cut of those sales, and then but that involves a lot of you have to have a lot of knowledge about like the intricate details of the business, how much they charge, what their margins are, what their volume is, that you probably don't have accurate knowledge. So like I said, what will often happen is that you'll way over or undercharge when you try to do value-based pricing. But a lot of people say that'll lead you to that value-based projects will lead you to the highest hourly rate, because especially once you have a lot of experience, say like I've been an app developer for 5 years now, if I can build like a really simple like 2-screen app in probably a day, and if I use value-based pricing for someone and I'm building them a storefront, then, you know, I could charge potentially like thousands of dollars an hour. That's what people who are proponents for value-based pricing say. But I say mostly you just need a lot of knowledge that you don't have and have no way of getting in order to do it properly and accurately. And so you might end up offending the client, basically.
Also, I know a lot of people do value-based, like sort of the first metric they take in is the size and capacity of the company. So, you know, like there's a difference between a startup asking you for a 2-page app and like BBC asking you for a 2-page app. And, you know, you sort of factor that in. Well, I know that this organization is prepared to spend a lot more. So, you know, that kind of comes in, but I agree with you. It's a complicated thing and it's really hard to get right. I always get it wrong. So I stay away from it nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can factor in that kind of company size thing when you're doing product-based pricing as well. So that is true. That's a good point. So does anyone else have anything to say about pricing? I know a lot of people get, it's a hard thing to do, especially when you're starting out, is figure out how much you're worth and how much people are willing to pay.
Yeah, I would just say that you were mentioning that a person may have spent years or, you know, a long time, and that's an investment in themselves that they didn't get paid for. And so then you're paying yourself back. But another way to look at it is that you had to spend all that time to learn what you're doing. The client needs what you know. And so it's a really good deal for them to pay you rather than for them to spend the years learning it when they need it now. So, you know, for anybody who tends to be a little bit like, oh, am I worth that much? Yeah, because they need it. And you spent all that time that they don't want to spend. So, you know, that's where the value is. Just another way of saying the same thing, I think.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So the client doesn't want to spend 5 years learning web development so they can build their product. And that's another thing I forgot to mention, is that consulting is not freelancing. They're two very different pricing things. And that's something that I always kind of knew, but I never did much consulting until the last few months. And so I came to this group and asked for help, and then got confirmation from Brian and other people that you should charge a lot more for consulting than freelancing. And I think Brian and probably other people in this group can talk more about that than me. But yeah, consulting and freelancing are very different.
Oh yeah, I wasn't aware of the difference. I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
I think the difference is that you're worth more when you're consulting, but I think probably someone else should talk about it.
Okay.
I tend to charge about double what I charge for consulting and freelancing, but I've only done 2 consulting projects and they've only just ended. So something I need to.
Yeah, I'd say that my work is more consultancy than freelance, where I'm coming in as in the US, we call it a 1099 employee.
Yeah.
Where I'm coming in and I don't have a project contract per se. I'm brought into a project as an additional member of their team.
Yeah.
Whereas freelancing,
consultants are essentially hires. Yeah.
Yeah. Temporary and no benefits, but that's okay. Whereas I see freelance as more, it's my my business responsibility to have a contract to do more of the business side of it than the actual coding that I do.
It's also worth, just from an industry perspective, consultants are more frequently eventually hired into staff versus freelancers, which usually will hop from project to project and are less likely to focus on one company too much, unless it's just happens to work out that way. But
okay, thanks.
And how I kind of structure it is that if I'm actually writing code or delivering a product, then I call that like freelancing. But when I do consulting, I say like, okay, I'll come in and do a code review, maybe like a high level architecture review. And then I tend to like basically write up a report on what I found. And like send them a PDF of, what I found, things I think they can improve on, things I think they're doing well. And then maybe on a couple projects, or on one project I just went through, like I basically did a pair programming session with one of their engineers, and we took a look through some of their Swift UI code, which is something that I kind of specialize in. And we went through it and, you know, identified problems and things that were good. And I charged double for that. So that was fun. Yeah. Yeah, so lifter pricing. This is something, communication is something that I've learned a lot of hard lessons about, particularly recently. So something new that I've added to the contract after I had a really horrible client experience this past, about 6 months ago now, was to put communication methods in the contract, because I had a client who was primary method of communication to, so it was a team, there was a client and he had a partner in his business. And then there was a business manager guy, like a salesy kind of person, and a designer and me. And our only method of communication was a big long message thread, which was horrible. And we couldn't find anything. There was no, like, we couldn't keep track of what we had spoken about. There was no sending files back and forth. And a lot of the time he would just be completely unresponsive. So now, after that horrible experience, I added a new clause to the contract, which basically lays out acceptable methods of communication, which, you know, you could change based on what the client is used to, but generally like Slack or email or whatever, some form of professional communication methods. And then that can also give you another chance to have an out clause. So another thing that's happened to me is a client didn't, trying to remember the details. I think it was I went about 2 weeks without any communication from the client. This is a few years ago now. So I thought, okay, well, I guess the contract is done. And also I wasn't really in a position, because I was in school, I wasn't really in a position where I could leave things hanging like that and then come back to them for any period of time. So I sent the client another message and said, hey, like, your communication style has just led to this project becoming untenable, and I think I'm going to have to leave the project. And he said, well, actually, I still have you under contract. And so now I put in a communication out clause where I say, I forget the exact language, but it's something like, if I don't hear from you for a week or two, then I consider the contract terminated. So yeah, most of these things that I'm talking about, I have learned because I messed them up at some point, which is fun. So that's definitely something I emphasize at the start of projects now. Oh yeah, so then there's budgeting, which comes into whether you're charging, which comes into what we were talking about before with your time estimates, if you're charging hourly, because the client might consider that estimate to be fixed and you might consider it to be flexible. And that's something you should really figure out ahead of time. So like I emphasized before, absolutely everything has a cost. The client wants an extra feature that's going to cost them extra money. If they want to go back and rewrite something that you've already done, that's also extra money. Unless you're doing project-based pricing, in which you might have negotiated some kind of you might have made some other kind of arrangement there. But yeah, and then so when you're doing budget changes, you have to include those procedures in the contract, how you're going to communicate about that, you know, ways to modify the contract. That should be something that's included from the start. Don't do anything that you're getting paid for. That includes phone calls, right? If you're being, like if you're doing Skype calls every day, daily stand-ups or whatever for 15, 20 minutes, you should bill for those, because it comes back to, again, valuing your time. If the client doesn't think of you as somebody whose time is worth money, then they will begin to treat you that way, and that is not great. So, you know, if you're billing for your phone calls, that probably won't make a huge difference in the budget, but it will make a huge difference to how the client kind of perceives you and communicates with you. So that's how I tend to think about that. And also, this last part is industry dependent, but for the most part, you're not going to be on call. The client cannot presume that they can contact you at any time and have you answer. You should lay out that you're working within specified hours, and that yes, you will communicate like quickly. You'll attempt to respond as fast as you can, but you are not available for phone calls at 3 a.m. to come fix their issue, unless that's specifically what you're getting paid for. So if you're doing back-end work and it's your job to maintain a server, then yes, you might be on call. But you know, for the most part, don't be don't present yourself as somebody who can just be called up at any time. You should maintain that kind of professional relationship of, you know, whatever it is for you, 9 to 5 work hours generally. But yeah, that's very industry dependent and will change depending on the situation. And if it does, include it in the contract. I don't have much else to say about that because I only tend to take on one project at a time. So none of my budgeting or accounting skills are ever super complicated. I only have like one spreadsheet related to each contract where I keep track of that stuff in. But if you're doing this stuff full time and you've got 3 or 4 contracts running at a time, this thing might get a little more complicated. But yeah, in my experience doing it part time, it's never been something that I need to spend a lot of time doing.
I guess one thing I'll throw in there is some projects, even in tech world, might require some material costs. Make sure you calculate that if there are. Don't front like the AWS bill or anything like that for something you're working on.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. Or I don't do hardware, but if you're doing hardware, also obviously put that kind of stuff in the contract. The contract is everything. Mine is very long now. My like standard template that I modify for each thing. There's a lot of stuff in there that doesn't even apply to every situation, but I've learned through hard experience that you should just include, because then you have receipts to point to. Yeah. That's budgeting.
Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
Actually, this isn't about so much about budget, it's more about communication, but do you include like a calendar of, or, you know, a list of dates? On this date, I will deliver this to you, and, you know, like, not like just one final deliverable, but like, this is like how far I've gotten, or this is what the, I don't know, some aspect of the project looks like, rather than waiting a few months and showing them something. And then also like having dates where the client is supposed to get something to you, because without that information, you can't proceed. Because I had a previous job where we just had all kinds of client problems because we knew our industry, but the consulting thing was just, and you know, then you get scope creep and it starts eating profits and all of this. And so we just kind of redesigned things. It was kind of my responsibility to do that. And we came up with something so that it was very clear, the expectations that we had of them and they could have of us. And that you said you only take on like one project at a time, but they don't need to know that. And so if they don't, you know, if this is their deadline and you're reminding them and they're not responding, it's something in the contract that says, you know, if they're delaying things by a certain amount of time, then I can't remember what language we use, but basically like timeframes might need to be renegotiated because, you know, again, I can't remember how we phrased it, but basically we were trying to cover ourselves because it was such a small operation and we did have multiple clients. And if a client delays by like 2 weeks, that could be our really, really heavy time with a different client. And it's not our fault that you didn't get us the information. So anyway, we put that in the contract. I was just wondering if that's something that you do.
Absolutely, yeah. It's something that I meant to bring up and just forgot. You have to have some kind of section for like client deliverables. Basically, you have to say very clearly, I cannot do this until you give me this. And until you give me this, I will not be doing any more work. And you have to include that like in the agreed communication methods, you know, whether over email or Slack or whatever you generally use. And then sometimes if I've previously had trouble with a client, when I say things like that, I'll also start screenshotting and timestamping them. So then when they come to me a week later and say, oh, I forgot, I meant to get you this, but I forgot. And then I can send them those receipts and say, okay, if you don't, like, if this project is lagging behind schedule, then maybe we need to renegotiate the budget or the time frame. Or like I said, you can have an out clause if it gets really kind of egregious. There was something else you mentioned that I wanted to add to, but now I forget. So that's fine, I guess.
Yeah, just outlining the project's milestones from both sides, from the client side, from your side, and giving a tentative schedule up front and how that could be affected.
Yeah, and I know some people who even do like, some people who do like dependency graphs, basically, where they'll actually draw like a chart, like a flow chart or a graph, and say, I can't like do this until like you provide me with this, and then it's all very clearly drawn out. Because, you know, it's not up to the client. If you have a non-technical client, maybe they just don't know, right? So then, but if you provide clear communication on that front, then you know, there's no room for them to blame you when things go wrong, which they will often try to do. I don't usually go that far, but I do keep receipts when I feel like it's necessary. Yeah, so then I also should bring up accounting, but like, I don't have much to say about it since it's super basic for me. Because like I said, I only take one project at a time, just keep it in a spreadsheet. There's probably other people here who have more experience and advice when it comes to accounting than that. If you grow it into a full-time business, I also know lots of people who have like hired accountants or who have like accountants that they go back to over time, but I don't have much to say about that. If anybody else wants to jump in, has more experience with that kind of thing, go for it.
Just owning my own business, I will agree that having a good accountant is worth whatever you spend on it, and finding someone that is willing to educate you can actually make that process end up be slightly cheaper over time, because you're tailoring what you provide to your accountant a little bit tighter, as opposed to like just here's this box crap, you know, figure it out. That's definitely paid off, and we've, you know, and over years saved several $100s, you know, just by taking a time to say, hey, how can I do this better for you next year? You know, having a little bit of a conversation with my CPA, as well as to like have conversations about what upcoming tax changes are going to affect me and how do I need to account for those, you know, going forward, my documentation style. So
right.
I definitely second reaching out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And they're really not that expensive, so it's not worth it to skimp. Like you're talking maybe $100 an hour for a good CPA, maybe more, but like it's not going to break the bank. You're not looking at thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah,
and that's a good point that you touched on, is like your the way you structure your business should change over time as laws change over time, right? So when you initially set up your business, the way that you pay yourself and the way that you structure your accountants and everything might be optimal for the way that tax laws are at that time. But then every few years, you should reevaluate that and see if you're, you know, it sounds a bit shady, but see if you're taking advantage of the current tax structure, because those things can change.
Something else I also heard, maybe other people can confirm, is just like to be clear on the difference between an accountant and a bookkeeper, and whoever you reach out to, knowing what they are and what role they have and what role you want.
Yep.
There's certain
you want an accountant. You can do bookkeeping yourself.
Yeah. So that's just something to look out for in terms of like when someone's advertising their skills to you and what you're paying them for.
Yep. So like Sarah said, you should get like a CPA, chartered personal accountant. But like you can do bookkeeping, like you can do it yourself. I took in grade like 12, I took an accounting class in high school where you learned like basic double column accounting. And that's probably the only high school course that is relevant to me every day. Like the one good thing I learned in high school. You can do the bookkeeping part yourself, and then that's the thing that you send off to your accountant, and they make sense of it all and basically tell you how much tax to pay and whatever. Cool. I think that's actually the last slide I have. Other things we could talk about are like invoicing. If anybody's interested in that, we could go back and cover something else, or we can just, you know, talk about anything related to freelancing at this point. That's all the notes that I have that I wanted to go over.
That was awesome. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
TK wants to hear about invoicing.
Invoicing, yeah. So invoicing is something that you can tie into your accounting, like depending on what kind of software you're using. You can use it to generate invoices a lot of the time. A lot of people like to use automated timer apps, where they will either based on like what things they have open will automatically track your time, or you just set timers yourself and assign them to certain clients. And then you can assign, so like you can have a list of clients that you assign the pricing structure to, whether it's hourly or project or whatever. And then you can use those to generate automated invoices and send them out. And that's usually what I do, just because it's easier than building it yourself, I guess. You should have a clause in your contract about when the invoice should be payable, and you should have a fee attached to a late invoice. There should, like, because if there's no incentive for them to pay you on time, then they won't. And that's the basic advice I have. There's lots more to say about it.
There's lots of obviously time tracking tools, invoicing tools that are kind of out there. It might take trial and error to figure out which one works best for you. I just would always say to ensure that if it costs you something, you need to make sure that, you know, you're covering those costs. You know, it's part of the ability to do business. Having a good CPA will, you know, guide you on those things. So just be smart, document everything, and recognize that sometimes using the paid version is to your advantage, because, you know, it's the cost of doing business, as opposed to just suffering with a lack of features for the free version. So yeah,
I guess that's another thing we can cover, just like more generally, is if you're doing freelancing for any significant amount of time It's a business, and you should treat it as such, and you should pay for tools that will make your life easier, because it will pay off in the end. Your clients will notice, you will notice, it'll make you more efficient, hopefully, if you pay for the right tools. Yeah, you should those tools exist for a reason, and people pay for them for a reason most of the time. You should treat your business as such.
Yep.
Stepping back to communication, I do like to have a project management software that I can either invite the clients to, or that might, as a contractor, I'm invited to their project management software for the projects that I'm involved in. That way there's always a way to update on what's going on, just like at any other web development business as a full-time employee.
Do you have any names for those tools? I think I've used one of those before, and I am just drawing a blank.
Basecamp is good if you have a small business client who's not into the web development scene, and they can upload content there, they can upload images, they can see what's going on. A Trello board is a little more technical, but it's still understandable for smaller businesses who are not big into web development. And then when I'm joining a web development group, it's we see Jira. It seems
Notion
to be the main one. Which one?
A lot of people like Notion. Just another Trello, kind of more advanced than Trello, I think, but another one of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to use Notion more for documentation of the project, like how to start your day, how to pull down the code, how to, add a PR, etc.
I'm big on Trello just because for a lot of the clients, like they don't necessarily want to get involved on the stuff I put up there, but it's just like, it's nice and it's visual and they can see stuff, they'll see the cards moving. And it just gives them like this visual this confirmation that the work is happening. And that's usually all that they want. It's just that it feels a little more secure than like communicating every few days or so. So Trello usually works for me. Oh, I had another question about the payment structure. Is it typical, I don't know if this changes from project to project, but do you bill for work to be done or work that has been done? Like on a Friday, is it like, okay, well, this is the cost of like what has been done for the last week? Or is it like okay, you pay now for the next 2 weeks of work? How do you typically structure that?
Right, if I'm doing project-based, I will generally just do half up front and half on completion. Which is because most of my projects aren't super long-term. If I was doing like a 6 months project, I would structure it differently than that. If I'm doing hourly pricing, I tend to just invoice every 2 weeks for work done in the past 2 weeks. But yeah, if I was doing anything more complicated or anything that was going for super long-term, I would do something different, but I've never had to.
So a quick question about your hourly billing. Have you ever had an issue where you got some work completed, and you said you bill for 2 weeks, and then the client is being a little bit iffy on payment? Like, how did you resolve that? Or if that never came up, did you ever like think about how you were going to resolve? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, that's definitely something you should think about, because they will, if you let them be late paying you, they will. It's my experience. People will often leave that to the last minute or longer, which is why, like I think I said earlier, that I include a clause in my contracts now with that includes a late fee for late invoices. That can be like a flat fee, just maybe like $100 or whatever. Not something super, like not something really expensive. And usually I don't resort to it. I just like, but it's just something you can point to and say, but if they're like 2 or 3 days late, you can say, by the way, I have this late fee coming up. You should really pay me what you owe me. I've never had any serious disputes where I had to, yeah, exactly. I've never had any serious disputes where I had to do anything more than that. I think it's mostly just like the client's mostly forgetting or not prioritizing payment, other than them being like super malicious. I've never run into that, but you know, people have. So
I think that's
definitely a thing that can happen.
Go ahead, Karen.
I also add a reminder memo on the invoice itself, like expect payment in 15 days. After, you know, after 30 days, we get a 5% late fee.
Yep. Some automated invoicing software will do that for you too. Like there's one called FreshBooks that some people use where it automates the entire thing, and then you can send reminder emails automatically, and you can see when they've opened it and stuff. So they can't do like a lot of people will do, oh, sorry, I missed it. I'm like, no, you didn't. I know you didn't. Please don't say that. So there's a lot of nice tools out there that can help you with that.
Yeah, I was pretty much just going to say, like, you know, that's another reason to pay for a really good tool, because making it easy for, you know, your customers to pay you definitely lowers that threshold for them getting money to you. Because if it's a process, it's like, you know, we've all been there. It's, oh, I'll pay that bill tomorrow. Oh, you know, I'll pay that bill next week. You know, I'll get to it. But when it's literally just go and click a button, I can do it real quick.
It's a pain in the ass to pay people. Like, I don't want to do it either when I hire like developers or like designers. It's just annoying and it feels bad. So making it easy on your clients will help.
In that vein, Cameron, I think you mentioned that you had a few, like you've had clients who were not based in Canada. So when you have that sort of international, I guess, a multinational payment scheme, how do you resolve that? Like, is it like a wire transfer thing, or is it just like PayPal, or what's your preferred?
Usually PayPal or wire transfer, whichever one works for them. I just leave everything in Canadian dollars and leave it up to them to convert. I check if they did it correctly, obviously, but yeah, usually they pick PayPal. PayPal has pretty high fees, but it's also easy. So, and I'm not charging enough money that the fees are taking like hundreds of dollars out of my pocket. So I tend to not worry about it too much.
Cool.
I can't think of anything else obvious that we haven't covered.
I just want to go. Yeah, I want to go add so much more stuff to my contract. Like, I was looking at like I've only done it freelance a couple of times. I'm like, oh, this is woefully under documented.
Yeah,
because all the stuff you're talking about that happened, I'm like, oh, I wish I'd written this in the contract.
My contract has grown over time. Basically every time I have a problem with a client, I identify the problem and add some kind of clause to the contract to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Have you ever, I guess, shared your contract with anyone, Cameron, to just kind of like, you know, do a little bit more direct knowledge transfer? Obviously, yes, you know, every jurisdiction for which your contract is drawn up, you know, there may be things that need to be different, but just the same general of like, I'm covering my rear end with this section, you know, this is the goal for that. Have you ever sat down and done that with another individual?
Nobody's really asked, to be honest. Like, if they asked me to, I would do that. But a lot of the things in the contract, like, I never expect to like sue anyone, basically. A lot of these things in the contract.
I don't think anybody expects to sue anybody, to be honest.
Yeah, right. Like, a lot of it is just to have receipts of things we agreed on and to give myself an out to cancel a contract if need be. It's not really meant to be like, I don't know. I'm struggling for words here. It's mostly just, it's like another communication tool, one that is very like formalized.
It sets expectations.
Yeah, it's an expectation setter.
Yep.
So I know you said you've been doing this like while you've been going to school for the most part, but how many hours a week do you think, like, let's say you have an active contract, how many hours a week do you think you put into that, just like in general?
Yeah, usually 10 to 15. My school, like I've had some, I tend to look at like my upcoming courses. This is very specific to me, probably no one else here, but like I'll look at my upcoming courses and I'll say, oh, I have like 3 calculus courses this semester. Maybe I'm not going to take on any contracts. And then I kind of structure it like that. Like the previous, like from last December to April, I was pretty free. So I took on a bit more than I usually would. I think I did like 20 to 30 hours a week that winter. Like I just tend to look ahead over the next like 4 months of my school and estimate how difficult it's going to be.
So